A millionaire pays his maid to have his child. When the baby is born, he is shocked. Everything changes. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Jacob Miller lived in a large mansion and felt empty, even though he was rich. That morning, Jacob found himself troubled by a thought that had been haunting him for a long time. What will happen to all of this when I'm gone? He had no idea. These thoughts consumed him. The sound of footsteps echoed from the main hall. He glanced out of his office window and saw Lucy Evans. The 25-year-old Jacob was worried about what would happen to everything after his death. He had no heir. As he thought about this, he heard footsteps from the main hall. He looked out of his office window and saw Lucy Evans, a 25-year-old who was carefully cleaning the crystal chandeliers. Lucy had been his maid for a few months. He rarely noticed her. However, in that moment, he noticed her. He noticed her determined posture and her focus on the task. She was simple, which was very different from the excessive world he inhabited. Jacob watched her longer than he should have. He had an idea. Lucy could be the solution to the problem he was trying to solve. She was young, healthy. Above all, didn't seem interested in impressing him. He could propose an arrangement. Something simple and easy to understand. She would have his baby in exchange for a lot of money. After that, she would move on with her life and leave the baby with him. As Jacob thought about his plan, Lucy continued her work, not knowing that she was being watched. Working at the mansion was her only choice. The salary barely covered the rent of the small apartment she shared with her sick mother. Almost all of her earnings went toward the medicines that kept her mother alive. It wasn't enough. Her mother's health was getting worse every day. The doctors had Lucy understood that she urgently needed surgery or she would not survive. She was doing everything she could to save money. She needed more money than she could ever dream of. Even so, she refused to give up. Her mother was all she had. Lucy knew she would do anything to save her. At the end of the day, as Lucy packed up her cleaning supplies, Jacob appeared in the hall. He rarely spoke directly to the staff. This time his firm voice broke the silence. "Lucy, come to my office. I need to speak with you." She froze. She felt a chill run through her. Something in his tone told her that something was wrong. She knew it was serious. She nodded, wiped her hands on her apron, followed him. As she stepped into the office, Lucy felt small. The shelves lined with books and the huge dark wood desk made the room feel even more intimidating. Jacob sat behind he sat at his desk, looking serious and not saying much. He pointed to a chair in front of him. Lucy sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "I'll be direct," he said. "I want you to have my child." A moment. It seemed like the world stopped spinning. To stop. Lucy blinked, confused, thinking she must have misunderstood. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice weaker than she intended. "I want you to have my child," Jacob repeated, as though discussing a straightforward business deal. "I don't want to get involved with anyone. I've tried. It's just not working," she said. "It doesn't work. I need someone to carry on what I've built. I think you're the right person for the job." Lucy was shocked. This couldn't be happening. How could he suggest something so strange? "I don't understand," she said. "Why me?" Jacob shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "You're discreet. Trustworthy. Don't have any emotional ties to me. I want something simple. In return, you'll receive a lot of money. Enough to change your life. Lucy's heart raced at those words. Money. She desperately needed money. This was crazy. How could she even consider something like this? What would happen afterward? She asked, trying to stay calm. After the baby is born, they'll stay with me. You'll receive the money and be free to move on with your life. I don't want complications. Lucy stared at him, incredulous. Part of her wanted to shout to let him know how cruel this was. There was another part. The part thinking about her mother's operation. The late rent. The decreasing supply of medicines. She knew she couldn't reject the idea so quickly. I don't know. This is too much, she said. Stammering and feeling lost. Jacob watched her. He waited for a few seconds and then said, think about it. Lucy. I'm offering you a unique opportunity to change your life. She didn't reply. His words echoed in her mind. She couldn't process them. With nothing more to say, Jacob concluded. You don't need to decide now. I'll give you a few more minutes. Days passed. Lucy realized that she needed to take advantage of this offer soon. She felt confused and overwhelmed as she walked to her room. The offer was very good. What if it was her only chance to save her mother? Lucy couldn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about what Jacob said, I want you to have my child. The idea seemed impossible. Lucy couldn't forget it. Her mother was getting weaker every day. The money she earned at the mansion was barely enough to pay for rent and medicine. The surgery was very important. Lucy knew she didn't have time to waste. As the sun finally rose on the horizon, Lucy was already up. Sitting at the small desk in her room. She stared at an old photo of her mother. In the picture, they were both smiling. Happy. Carefree. That seems so far away now. Lucy felt a lump in her throat. She closed her eyes. Trying to hold back the tears, all she wanted was to give her mother a chance to live. At what cost? Part of her said that accepting would be a huge sacrifice. Necessary, the other part screamed that it was wrong. That she would be selling something priceless. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was. It was from the clinic where her mother was receiving treatment, Miss Evans. The receptionist began. We're calling to remind you that the deadline for surgery is approaching. Without it, unfortunately, we can't guarantee your mother's recovery. A date has been reserved. We'll need confirmation and payment. Lucy thanked her. Lucy was on the phone with the clinic where her mother was receiving treatment. Miss Evans. The receptionist began. We're calling to remind you that the deadline for surgery is approaching. Without it, unfortunately, we can't guarantee your mother's recovery. We've reserved a date. We'll need confirmation and payment. Lucy thanked her and hung up. The tightness in her chest grew even stronger. Time was running out. She didn't even have half the money needed. She knew that without the surgery, her mother wouldn't survive. When Lucy returned to the mansion, she found Jacob in his office. He was standing by the window. He turned as soon as he heard her. She felt a tightness in her chest. Time was running out. She didn't even have half the money needed. She knew that without the surgery, her mother wouldn't survive. When Lucy returned to the mansion, she found Jacob in his office. He was standing by the window. He turned as soon as he heard her footsteps. Lucy hesitated at the door. feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "Come in. Lucy," he said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. "Have you made a decision?" She took a deep breath before responding. "Not yet. I need to understand better what you're proposing." Jacob nodded, as though he had expected this. He sat in his chair, resting his arms on the desk. "It's simple. There will be no physical involvement between us. Everything will be done through artificial insemination during the pregnancy. You'll have full support. Housing. Medical care. Proper nutrition after the birth. You'll receive a sum that will allow you to start a new life. Life in exchange for the child. You will have no responsibilities or rights over them." The words came out coldly, as if he were closing another business deal. Lucy looked at him, trying to understand the man in front of her. He seemed so confident, convinced that he was offering something fair. For her, it was anything but simple. "Can I think about it a bit more?" she asked. Rising slowly, Jacob nodded. "Of course. Don't take too long." The next day, Lucy woke up with a decision. Despite everything, she knew she had no other choice. She couldn't live with herself if she lost her mother. Knowing there had been a solution, no matter how absurd. After Lucy stopped at the door, feeling nervous. "Come in," Jacob said, pointing to the chair in front of his desk. "Have you made a decision?" Lucy took a deep breath before responding. "Not yet. I need to understand better what you're proposing." Jacob nodded, as though he had expected this. Lucy finished her morning tasks and went to Jacob's office. He was reviewing documents when she entered. As soon as he saw her, he put down his pen and clasped his hands on the desk, waiting for her to speak. "I accept," Lucy said bluntly. Jacob raised his eyebrows, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "I didn't ask for reasons or—" Lucy hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "Come in. Lucy," he said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. "Have you made a decision?" She took a deep breath before responding. "Not yet. I need to understand better what you're proposing." Jacob nodded, as though he had expected this. Expect her to explain. To him, everything was a matter of logic and mutual benefits. "Excellent," he said, retrieving a prepared contract. "Read this carefully. I want to make sure everything is clear to you before we sign." Lucy took the document with trembling hands. As she read it, she noticed that every detail was outlined: the support she would receive, the money after the birth. The contract would guarantee that she would not have any rights over the child. It was all very clinical and calculated. When she finished reading, she looked at Jacob. He handed her a pen. After a brief hesitation, she signed it. It was official. Her life was about to change forever. Lucy hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "Come in," he said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. "Have you made a decision?" She took a deep breath before responding. "Not yet. I need to understand better what you're proposing." Jacob nodded, as though he had expected this. A heavy silence filled Jacob Miller's office after Lucy signed the contract. The pen was still in her hand. Her mind felt distant, weighed down by the enormity of what she had just agreed to. Jacob, seated in his chair, calmly collected the document with the demeanor of someone who had just closed another lucrative deal. He looked at her. He didn't seem to be thinking about anything in particular. "It's done," he said, putting the contract into a folder. From now on, all arrangements will be made to start the process. Lucy didn't say anything. Her heart was beating very fast. She had made a decision. She couldn't stop thinking about it. She felt like she was crossing a line. She needed the money fast. Her mother was going to have the surgery. The rent was late again. None of that made her feel better. Jacob stood up, adjusting his tie. He seemed ready to move on with the next step of his routine. He turned. Lucy hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "Come in, Lucy," he said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. "Have you made a decision?" She took a deep breath before responding. "Not yet. I need to understand better what you're proposing." Jacob nodded, as though he had expected this. To Lucy, before she could leave, "I want you to know that everything will be handled to ensure your comfort. Whatever you need will be made available." Lucy nodded in response. His words seemed to float in the air, unable to pierce through the chaos in her mind. As she left the office, she felt the weight of the choices she had made. Lucy hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "Come in, Lucy," he said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. "Have you made a decision?" She took a deep breath before responding. "Not yet. I need to understand better what you're proposing." Jacob nodded, as though he had expected this. Made. Also the urgency driving her forward. There was no alternative. That night, in the small room she occupied at the mansion, Lucy stared at the ceiling. The decision should have brought relief. All she felt was a knot in her stomach. She picked up her phone, hesitating before calling her mother. "Hello, sweetheart." Lucy's mother sounded weak when she called. Lucy felt a mix of comfort and pain. "Hi Mom. I just wanted to see how you're feeling today," Lucy replied, trying to sound calm. "I'm a little tired. I'm okay. You, sweetheart. You're not working too hard, are you?" Her mother's concern was genuine. Lucy felt the weight of the lie. Lucy felt like crying when she heard her mom's quiet voice on the phone. "Mom. I'm doing okay. I'm a little tired. I'm going to be fine." "Honey. Are you working too much?" Lucy knew her mom was worried. She had to lie. "I'm fine, Mom. Everything is under control." After she ended the call, Lucy started to cry. She couldn't tell the truth. Hearing her mom's voice made her strong. Everything she was doing was for her mom, even if it was too hard. Jacob didn't seem to know that Lucy was upset. She had to act like everything was fine, even though she wasn't. After hanging up, Lucy started crying. She couldn't tell the truth. Hearing her mother's voice made her strong. Everything she was doing was for her mother, even if it was too hard. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed unaware of Lucy's emotional problems. He spent the evening reviewing the contract again, making sure there were no problems. It was an almost obsessive habit. That wasn't what bothered him. Lucy's expression as she signed the contract kept replaying in his mind. There was something about that moment he couldn't quite identify. A mixture of determination and pain that upset him. The next morning, Jacob made all the arrangements to start the artificial insemination process immediately. He hired the best specialists to ensure every step was done correctly. When he told Lucy about the first appointment, He insisted on going with her. She tried to protest. "I don't think it's necessary. I can go alone," she said, trying to avoid more contact than necessary. "I want to make sure everything is done properly," Jacob replied, ending the discussion. During the car ride to the clinic, silence filled the air. Lucy stared out the window, trying to ignore Jacob's presence beside her. He, on the other hand, seemed perfectly comfortable with the quiet, as if it were just another business meeting. At the clinic, the doctor explained every detail of the procedure. Lucy listened carefully, asking occasional questions, while Jacob remained silent but attentive. He only spoke once, ensuring that all the steps would be meticulously followed. The first procedure went well. Lucy received the news a few weeks later. The insemination had worked. She felt a mix of relief and fear. It was real now. A life was growing inside her. In the end, she would have to let it go. The thought was almost unbearable. During the first few months, Lucy tried to maintain a normal routine. The pregnancy brought inevitable changes. Her relationship with Jacob remained formal. Something began to shift. He started asking more about how she was feeling and began showing up frequently for her medical appointments. Lucy noticed these gestures. Chose he didn't think much of it. One day, while she was relaxing in the garden, Jacob showed up out of the blue. He stood next to her and watched her for a moment before saying something. "How are you feeling today?" he asked. His tone was lighter than usual. Lucy looked at him, surprised by the question. She hadn't expected him to show concern. "I'm fine. Thanks. I'm just tired," she replied, trying to hide the emotional exhaustion that consumed her. Jacob nodded, appearing thoughtful. "If you need anything, just let me know. I don't want anything to compromise your health or the baby's." She didn't know how to react. Jacob's usual coldness seemed to be giving way. Lucy refused to let her guard down, even though she was starting to see Jacob as more than just a man. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, her tone slightly provocative. "It doesn't seem like something you'd normally worry about," Jacob said, staring at her for a moment as if carefully considering his response. "Because this will change everything," he finally said. His voice was so sincere that it surprised her. The first time, Jacob seemed more vulnerable and less calculating. Lucy looked away, not wanting to acknowledge his humanity. It was easier to think of him as a cold man focused solely on his own interests. Lucy's days followed an outwardly calm routine. On the inside, she felt like a storm was coming. Her pregnancy was going well. She could see the baby moving more and more. With every movement, Lucy felt a mix of joy and sadness. She was happy about the new life growing inside her. Sad because she knew she would have to give it up. Jacob was more present than Lucy had expected. He was still cold. He also did things that showed he was a better person than Lucy thought. He went with her to medical appointments, asked the doctor questions, made sure she had everything she needed. But Lucy still kept her emotional guard up. She didn't want to believe that Jacob genuinely one hot morning. Lucy decided to help Stephanie organize the library. She was feeling bored and thought that helping out would help pass the time. She spent hours climbing a small ladder, arranging books, cleaning shelves, dusting. When she finally finished, a sudden wave of dizziness overwhelmed her. "Are you okay?" Stephanie asked, rushing over when she saw Lucy sit on the floor holding her stomach. I just need to catch my breath, Lucy replied, trying to sound calm. The pain spreading through her abdomen made her wince. Stephanie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the phone and called Jacob, who was in his office. Within minutes, he walked into the library with purpose and a worried look on his face. What happened? He demanded, his tone firm. I just overdid it a little, Lucy said, trying to make the situation seem less serious. The pain on her face showed that it was serious. Jacob stared at her for a moment, his expression tense. Stephanie, get the car, he ordered. We're taking her to the doctor now. At the clinic, the doctor examined Lucy thoroughly, running several tests. Jacob sat beside her, arms crossed, his expression serious. When the doctor returned with the results, his tone was firm. Lucy, your pregnancy requires more care. Stress and intense physical activity can cause problems. You need to rest more and avoid any unnecessary strain. Rest is essential to ensure the pregnancy progresses smoothly. Lucy nodded, embarrassed. She felt guilty for not being more careful. She had just been trying to keep her mind occupied. Jacob, however, wasn't about to let the issue slide. You heard the doctor say. Lucy, rest. This isn't a suggestion. It's necessary, he said, his voice firm as he helped her stand up. On the drive back to the mansion, the silence in the car was uncomfortable. Lucy avoided looking at Jacob. She could feel the tension from him. When they arrived, he helped her out of the car and walked her to her room. Why do you insist on ignoring your limits? He began, arms crossed. Don't you realize this isn't just about you? There's another life at stake. Lucy took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears. I know Jacob. I know him better than anyone. I just don't want to feel useless. He was quiet for a moment, as if thinking about what she had just said. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about being useful or not. Lucy, if you want to do something, do what's best for the baby. And that means resting. Despite the firm tone, there was a hint of concern in his voice. Lucy simply nodded. Too tired to argue. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type milkshake in the comments. Only those who make it this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. In the days that followed, Jacob seemed determined to ensure Lucy followed the doctor's orders. He hired a nurse to monitor her and reorganize the household schedule so Stephanie could take over all the tasks Lucy insisted on helping with. Initially reluctant, Lucy eventually realized that Jacob was trying to make her feel comfortable, even if he was strict about certain decisions. You don't. Lucy complained one afternoon while sitting in the living room and sipping tea. Jacob, who was reviewing documents in the same room, looked up at her. It's not watching. It's precaution, he replied, his eyes returning to the papers. Lucy sighed. Deep down knew he was right. Sitting idle made her feel powerless. She knew she had to prioritize the baby. One day, Jacob arrived with a large package and placed it next to Lucy. What's this? She asked, curious. Something, he replied. To keep you busy without having to leave your chair. He replied, pulling out coloring books and colored pencils. It might seem childish, I've heard it's relaxing. Lucy laughed, surprised by the gesture. You actually bought coloring books for me, she said. I don't see the harm in trying something new. He said with a faint smile. I might even join you. She looked at him for a moment, trying to figure out if he was joking or serious. It was hard to imagine Jacob Miller, the most rigid man she had ever met, being so relaxed, sitting down to color. Even though it was just a gesture, it made her happy. As time went on, Lucy got used to her new routine. She spent more time reading, listening to music, coloring. Jacob sometimes came to keep her company. He always had a practical excuse. I just want to make sure you're following the doctor's orders, he would say as he sat down next to her. Lucy noticed that, even though Jacob was still formal, he was changing. He was still practical and focused on his goals. He was determined. He also seemed kinder than usual. He started asking about how she was feeling, both physically and emotionally. One evening, while Lucy was sitting on the porch enjoying the breeze, Jacob came out with 2 mugs of tea. I brought these for you, he said, handing one to her. One of the mugs was her cup. Lucy thanked him, touched by the gesture. Thank you, she said. It's nice to know I'm being taken care of. Jacob sat down next to her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just listened to the sound of the wind and the trees. Finally, he broke the silence. Lucy, I know this isn't easy, he said. For you and me. I know I can be a bit too intense at times. I want you to know I'm trying my best. She looked at him, surprised by his confession. I know, Jacob. I appreciate it. Despite everything. At that moment, both of them felt that something had changed. They were no longer just 2 people bound by a bond was starting to form between them. They couldn't admit it. That afternoon, as Lucy tried to distract herself with a book, her phone rang. It was her neighbor, who was taking care of her mother. The neighbor was calling to inform Lucy that her mother had fallen ill again. Lucy's heart raced. She quickly hung up the phone and sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking. She felt overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility and fear. Suddenly, she started to have trouble breathing. Jacob was in his office, reviewing contracts, when he heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Stephanie knocked on his door urgently. Mr. Miller. It's Lucy. Something seems wrong. She's unwell in her room. Jacob immediately got up, crossing the hallways quickly to Lucy's room. When he entered, he found her sitting on the floor with her hands on her head, breathing heavily. Lucy. What's happening? He asked, kneeling beside her. She tried to respond. The words came out, Lucy. Is something wrong? She's unwell in her room. Jacob immediately got up and quickly crossed the hallways to Lucy's room. When he entered, he found her sitting on the floor with her hands on her head, breathing heavily. Lucy. What's happening? He asked, kneeling beside her. She tried to respond. The words came out broken. I can't breathe. Jacob grabbed a glass of water from the bedside table and held it in front of her. Drink this. Breathe slowly. I'm here, he said, his tone firm yet concerned. Gradually, Lucy managed to calm down. Her hands were still trembling. Her breathing began to stabilize. Jacob helped her up and guided her. Broken. I can't breathe. Jacob took a glass of water from the bedside table and held it in front of her. Drink this. Breathe slowly. Lucy. I'm here. He said in a firm yet concerned tone. Gradually, Lucy managed to calm down. Her hands were still trembling. Her breathing began to stabilize. Jacob helped her up and guided her to sit on the bed. Are you feeling better? He asked. Looking at her seriously. Lucy nodded. Her teary eyes revealed that she was far from okay. It was just a panic attack, she murmured. Trying to look away. Jacob, however, wasn't convinced. It wasn't just that, he pressed. Lucy hesitated. Telling the truth about her mother meant exposing her vulnerability. She wasn't ready for that. But the genuine concern in Jacob's eyes disarmed her. My mother. She's getting worse. The surgery needs to happen soon. I'm stuck here. I feel like there's nothing I can do to help her. Jacob was silent for a moment. Processing. What she had said that it was the first time she had mentioned her mother. He realized. The first time. How much Lucy had been carrying on her own. Lucy. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked. His voice softer than usual because it doesn't make a difference. She replied bitterly that I agreed to this arrangement to save my mother. I know the money will help. Until then. I can't do anything but wait. Jacob felt guilty. He had always seen their arrangement as a simple deal. Now he understood that for Lucy, it was much deeper. She was giving up more than he had ever imagined. That you're not alone. Lucy. He finally said. I know it feels like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I'm here. If you need anything. Just tell me. Lucy looked at him. Surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Despite his usual coldness. In that moment Jacob seemed almost human. That same night, while Lucy slept, Jacob picked up the phone and made a quick call. He asked his team to investigate Lucy's mother's situation and resolve the issue immediately. The next day, he went to the hospital himself, signing papers and covering the costs of the surgery and future treatments. A few days later, Lucy's phone rang again. It was the hospital. Miss Lucy. We're calling to let you know that your mother's surgery has been fully paid for and we can schedule the procedure in the coming days. Lucy was stunned. Almost dropping the phone. What do you mean? Who paid for it? She asked. Her heart racing. We can't disclose that information. All expenses have been covered. The attendant replied. Lucy hung up and sat on her bed. Trying to process the news. The only person who could have done this was Jacob, determined to confront him. She went downstairs to his office. Jacob. I need to talk to you, she said. Walking in without knocking. That he looked up from his laptop. A faint smile playing on his lips. That is something wrong? It was you. Wasn't it? You paid for my mother's surgery. She crossed her arms. Jacob sighed. Leaning back in his chair. It wasn't exactly a secret that you needed help. Why? Why did you do this? He stood up. Walking toward her. Consider it an advance on our agreement. Lucy. Just accept it and don't argue. Without arrogance. Lucy shook her head. Torn between gratitude and pride. I don't know how to thank you. Jacob. This is more than I ever expected. Don't thank me. He replied. Just focus on taking care of her. Lucy remained silent for a few seconds. Overwhelmed by her emotions. All right. I accept. She finally said. She felt a heaviness in her heart. She knew her mother would be safe. Something else was stirring inside her. Lucy went back to her room, thinking about the situation. For the first time, she saw Jacob as more than the cold, calculated man he showed to the world, perhaps behind the facade of a rigid millionaire. There was someone who truly cared. The relief of knowing her mother would have the surgery brought tears to Lucy's eyes. She was happy. She couldn't shake the weight of everything that was happening. She gazed out the window, lost in thought as the moon lit up the dark sky. Jacob, meanwhile, returned to his work. Jacob said after a moment, thinking hard. He knew he was getting more involved than he should. Strangely, he didn't regret it. In the following days, Jacob began showing more care toward Lucy. He made a point of asking how she was and offered to help her with small things. Though his gestures were subtle, Lucy noticed a change in his behavior. One evening, she was sitting in the living room with a warm cup of tea when Jacob came in with a package. "I got something for you," he said, handing her the package. Lucy opened it and found a soft, colorful blanket. "It's for the colder nights," he explained. Looking slightly, Lucy noticed a change in Jacob's behavior. One evening, she was sitting in the living room with a warm cup of tea when he came in with a package. "I got something for you," he said, handing her the package. Lucy opened it and found a soft, colorful blanket. "It's for the colder nights," he explained, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Thank you, Jacob." "It's beautiful," Lucy said, smiling. He nodded, seeming relieved that she liked it. He sat down in a nearby armchair and watched as she draped the blanket over her legs. "You always try to handle everything on your own, don't you?" he asked, breaking the silence. Lucy looked up, surprised by the question. "I guess I've never really had a choice. It's always just been me and my mom. There was no one else to help." "That explains a lot," Jacob thought to himself. "More to myself than to her." Lucy frowned. "What do you mean? You're different from the people I know. They always have ulterior motives. You just want to take care of your mother. It's rare to find someone like that." Lucy was speechless. It was the first time Jacob had said something so personal to her. As her pregnancy progressed, Lucy's moments of vulnerability became more frequent. One day, while she was sitting in the garden trying to relax, Jacob appeared with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. "I thought you might enjoy some company," he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful, they sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. "Have you always been this controlled?" Lucy suddenly asked. Breaking the silence, Jacob he came in with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. "I thought you might like some company," he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful. They sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. "Have you always been this controlled?" Lucy suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Look at her, surprised by the question. "Controlled? Maybe. I've always thought it was the only way to keep things running smoothly." "And does it work?" she pressed, curious. He was silent for a moment, staring at the horizon. "Most of the time. Yes. Not always," he admitted. Lucy could tell he was being honest. It made her feel He came in with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. "I thought you might like some company," he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful. They sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. "Have you always been this controlled?" Lucy suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Closer to him. It was as though, little by little, they were breaking down the walls between them. The connection between them continued to grow in subtle ways. Jacob started making more time to be around Lucy, even if he wouldn't admit it to himself. He knew something was changing within him. He wasn't sure how to handle it. Lucy. Jacob's presence was comforting. It also left her feeling conflicted. She sensed they were growing closer. She didn't want to allow herself to form bonds that might eventually break. Both of them understood that the contract that had brought them together was just the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated, but they were far from understanding where it would lead. The atmosphere in the mansion felt different since the night Jacob had comforted Lucy. Their interactions had subtly changed, that he seemed more present, more attentive. Lucy was beginning to let her guard down. The contract that had initially tied them together now felt like a mere detail in the midst of something greater. Though neither of them was willing to admit it, that evening, while Lucy was resting in the living room, Jacob appeared with an unexpected invitation. "Lucy. Tomorrow night. I'd like you to have dinner with me, something more formal." She looked up from the book she was reading. She appeared with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. "I thought you might enjoy some company," he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful. They sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. "Have you always been this controlled?" Lucy suddenly asked, breaking the silence. "Jacob," she said, intrigued. "A formal dinner?" she asked, surprised. "Why?" Jacob hesitated before answering, as if searching for the right words. "Consider it a gesture of gratitude for what you're doing. You're going through all of this for something greater than yourself. I think it's the least I can do." Lucy tried to hide the blush rising. She appeared with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. "I thought you might enjoy some company," he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful. They sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. "Have you always been this controlled?" Lucy suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Not something I expected to hear from Jacob, she thought. The cold, calculated man who treated her as part of their arrangement. Nonetheless, she nodded in agreement. "All right. A formal dinner then." The following evening, Lucy descended the stairs in a simple yet elegant dress that Stephanie had helped her with. He came in with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. "I thought you might like some company," he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful. They sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. "Have you always been this controlled?" Lucy suddenly asked, breaking the silence. "Which one did you choose?" Jacob replied. She was nervous, which didn't make sense to her. After all, it was just dinner. Something about the way Jacob looked at her as he waited in the dining room made her even more uneasy. Jacob was impeccable in a black suit, something usual for him. But the way his eyes softened when he saw her made her feel something. She didn't know him very well. He pulled out a chair for her, a gesture she hadn't expected. "You look beautiful," he said casually. Sincerely. Thank you, Lucy replied, taking her seat. You look formal. Jacob gave a faint smile before sitting down. The meal began in silence. The sound of silverware was the only noise in the expansive dining room. Feeling uncomfortable, Lucy decided to break the silence. So do you often have dinners like this? She asked. Trying to sound casual, Jacob glanced up. Amused by the question. No. Not really. It's rare for me to have company during meals, usually. It's just business meetings that I think I've forgotten what it's like to have a real conversation at. He came in with 2 chairs and a tray of juice. I thought you might enjoy some company, he said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. Lucy smiled. Grateful. They sat side by side in silence for a while, enjoying the gentle breeze. Have you always been this controlled? Lucy suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Dinner? Jacob replied. Lucy chuckled softly. Well. At least now I know I'm not just another business transaction. Jacob tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. You were never just a business transaction, Lucy said. I think it took me a while to realize that. His words caught her off guard. She looked away, trying to process what he had said. His tone was so sincere that it made her feel relaxed. As they continued to talk during dinner, Lucy started to feel more comfortable. She started to share stories about her childhood. She talked about how hard it was to grow up in a simple home. She explained that her mother always tried her best to make life better for Lucy, even if it meant that her own life was not as good. His tone made her feel comfortable. As they continued talking, they became more relaxed. Lucy started to feel more comfortable. She started talking about her childhood. She told him stories about the challenges of growing up in a simple home. She said that her mother had always tried to make her life better, even if it meant that her own life was not as good. My mother has always been my inspiration, Lucy said, smiling. She gave up so much for me. I think that's why I'm doing all of this now. I want to make sure she has the chance to live without pain and without fear. Jacob listened closely. This was rare for him. The first time. My mother has always been my inspiration, Lucy said, smiling a little sadly. She sacrificed so much for me. I think that's why I'm doing all of this now. I want to make sure she has the chance to live without pain, without fear. Jacob listened intently. Something rare for him. The first time. He seemed genuinely interested in someone else. Your mother must be an incredible woman, he said after a moment. And so are you. Not many people would do what you're doing. Lucy felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. Quickly changed the subject. What about you? She asked. What was your childhood like? Like Jacob. He hesitated as if reluctant to talk about himself. But after a moment, he decided to share a little. My childhood was complicated. My father was a very demanding man. Everything revolved around expectations. He wanted me to be perfect, to follow in his footsteps. And well, I think I became exactly what. Jacob paused, as if unwilling to talk about himself. After a moment, he decided to share a little. My childhood was difficult. My father was very demanding. Everything revolved around expectations. He wanted me to be perfect and follow in his footsteps. I think I became exactly what he wanted. Did that make you happy? Lucy asked. Curious. Jacob let out a short laugh. Happiness wasn't the goal. Success was. But after he was gone, I realized that none of it meant anything if you didn't have someone to share it with. His words carried a melancholy that Lucy hadn't expected in that moment. She saw that Jacob wasn't just the cold, calculating man he appeared to be. He had deep scars, too. As the conversation flowed, Jacob began to talk about his past relationships. He mentioned the heartbreaks he had endured and how they had made him distrust any emotional connection. People don't care about who you are, Lucy. They care about what you can give them. And when they realize there's nothing more to take, they just leave. Lucy felt the weight of his words. For a moment, she understood the reason behind his coldness. He had built that wall as a form of protection. It was clear that it had also, but that's not what makes you happy. Is it? Lucy asked. Surprised. Success is. Happiness isn't the goal, Jacob said. A short laugh escaping him. But after he was gone, I realized that none of it mattered if you didn't have someone to share it with. His words were full of sadness. They separated him from everyone else. Not everyone is like that, Jacob, she said gently. Some people care about who you are, not what you have. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if she was really saying what she meant. Maybe you're right, he finally said. But it's hard to trust again when you've been betrayed so many times. Lucy didn't respond. Her face showed more than words could. She knew what it was like to trust someone and be disappointed, even though their experiences were different. She felt a connection with Jacob in that moment. When dinner was over, Jacob walked her to the living room. They sat down. The couch. The silence between us now. Comfortable, Lucy said, sensing that something had shifted. Thank you for dinner, Jacob, she said, smiling. Different can be good sometimes, he replied, looking at her with a softer expression. A moment. Jacob's eyes locked onto hers. Lucy felt warmth rising in her cheeks. She looked away, trying to hide what she was feeling. Deep down, they both knew something was happening, a bond was forming, even if neither of them was ready to admit it. The morning was sunny as Jacob parked his car in front of the ultrasound clinic. Lucy sat beside him. Lucy watched the activity outside with a mix of worry and curiosity. This was the first appointment where they would clearly see the baby. Jacob had insisted on coming with her. Ready? He asked, turning off the engine and looking at Lucy. She nodded, trying to calm her nerves. Although it was an important moment, there was something unsettling about sharing it with Jacob. His growing presence and attentiveness left her feeling conflicted. The two entered the clinic, where the doctor greeted them. After a few instructions, Lucy was taken to the exam room, with Jacob staying by her side. He maintained he wanted to be happy. He wasn't sure if that would make his child happy. Lucy asked. Curious. Jacob let out a short laugh. Happiness wasn't the goal. Success was. After he was gone, I realized that none of it meant anything if you didn't have someone to share it with. His words carried a melancholy that Lucy hadn't expected. In that moment, his serious demeanor, his attention never wavered. When the ultrasound began, the sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room. It was a strong, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo in every corner. Jacob, who was used to controlling every situation, sat completely still. The first time in a long time. But that didn't make you happy. Did it? Lucy asked. Curious. Happiness wasn't the goal, Jacob said. Laughing briefly. Success was. But after he was gone, I realized that none of it meant anything if you didn't have someone to share it with. His words carried a sadness that Lucy hadn't expected. I feel something I can't describe, he said. This is the baby's heartbeat. The doctor explained, pointing to the screen. Everything looks healthy and on track. Jacob's eyes remained fixed on the grainy image on the screen. This isn't just an abstract plan or a distant idea. It's a life. His child. Growing right there. He couldn't look away, Lucy. Meanwhile, watched Jacob's reactions more than the screen. She saw how captivated he was. Almost lost in the moment that it moved her in a way she hadn't expected, she had already felt the baby grow inside her. Seeing Jacob react like that made it all the more transformative. Real. Lucy said. Surprised. When the exam was over, Jacob finally looked at Lucy. His eyes showed an emotion he couldn't hide. This is incredible, he said quietly. It's real, Lucy said. Smiling. She felt a pang of fear deep down. She knew that with each passing day, they were growing closer. Not just to the baby, but they were thinking about each other. Which made the thought of moving on after the baby's birth even harder. Back in the car. The silence was heavy. Jacob, who usually knew exactly what to say, seemed lost in thought. Lucy stared out the window, trying to ignore the emotional turmoil within her. Thank you for letting me come with you, he said. Finally breaking the silence. It was important for me. Too, Lucy replied. Still looking out the window. I think it's good to share moments like these. Jacob hesitated before speaking again. I never thought something. I was affected by this. I always saw it as a transaction. Today, hearing the heartbeat, I realized it's so much more than that. Lucy turned to him, surprised by how sincere his words were. Jacob rarely expressed his feelings so openly. Yes, she said with a faint smile. No matter how much we try to stay detached, this will always be bigger than us. They looked at each other for a moment. Lucy could see that Jacob was changing. He was no longer just the cold, calculating man she had first met. Something inside him seemed she was awakening. It bothered her. In the weeks that followed, Jacob became more involved in the details of the pregnancy. He insisted on going with Lucy to every appointment, even if it meant changing his busy schedule. He also began asking about things that had once seemed small and not important. He asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything specific, if she had eaten properly. One day, Lucy was in the kitchen preparing a salad when Jacob walked in. He crossed his arms as he watched her. You should be resting, he said, sounding a little angry. Lucy laughed calmly as she cut tomatoes. Jacob, I'm just making a salad. I think I can handle this. He stepped closer and took the knife from her hand. Let me do it. If the doctor said you need to rest, then rest. Lucy sighed but gave in. She sat on a nearby chair and watched as Jacob awkwardly sliced the tomatoes. Who would have thought the great Jacob Miller knows how to chop tomatoes, she teased with a playful smile. Don't spread the word, he replied with a smirk. I have a reputation to maintain. They both laughed. The light a kind gesture made the tension between them disappear. Lucy saw that Jacob was becoming more human and friendly. This made her like him even more. Even though she didn't want to admit it. One night, as Lucy was reading in bed, Jacob came to her door. He stopped and then went in, holding a small package. "I brought this," he said. A moment of heartache eased the tension between them. Lucy realized that Jacob was becoming more human, more approachable. It made her like him even more, though she didn't want to admit it. One night, as Lucy lay in bed reading, Jacob appeared at her door. He hesitated before stepping in, holding a small package in his hands. "I brought something for you," he said, placing the package on the bedside table. Lucy opened it to find a small, empty photo album. "I thought you might want to keep some memories of this journey," he explained, looking a bit uncomfortable. Lucy felt her eyes fill with tears. It was a simple gesture. It carried so much meaning. She smiled at him, deeply moved. "Thank you, Jacob. It's perfect." He nodded, standing in silence for a moment before leaving the room. Lucy stared at the album, feeling even more connected to him. The thought of saying goodbye after the baby was born seemed unbearable for Jacob. The ultrasound had been a turning point. He could no longer ignore the emotions that were beginning to surface. The baby was no longer just a distant idea, it was real. He felt he needed to be more than just a financial provider, he needed to be a father. Lucy, on the other hand, was conflicted. She knew she was growing attached not only to the baby but also to Jacob. He was revealing himself to be a different man. Someone she hadn't expected to find beneath his cold exterior, but the contract still loomed between them. A constant reminder that all of this had an expiration date, that in the days that followed. The tension between Lucy and Jacob grew steadily, fueled by intense moments and the barriers they both insisted on maintaining. Neither seemed willing to admit what was happening. The contract hung over them as a constant reminder that everything they were building had a timeline. One quiet afternoon, Lucy sat in the garden, flipping through the pages of a book. A tender moment eased the tension between them. Lucy realized that Jacob was becoming more human, more approachable. It made her like him even more, though she didn't want to admit it. One night, as Lucy read in bed, Jacob appeared at her door. He hesitated before stepping in, holding a small package in his hands. "I brought the photo album you gave me," he said. "I've already begun filling it with small memories. Medical notes. Details about the baby. Even a dried flower I picked during a walk." The album had become a reflection of her emotions. A way to feel like she was creating something meaningful. Jacob appeared on the terrace, watching her from a distance for a moment before approaching. A moment of tenderness eased the tension between them. Lucy realized that Jacob was becoming more human, more approachable. It made her like him even more, though she didn't want to admit it. One night, as Lucy read in bed, Jacob appeared at her door. He hesitated before stepping in, holding a small package in his hands. "I brought some papers," he said, his serious expression making it clear he had come with a purpose. "Lucy, we need to talk." "What about?" she asked, anticipating that Jacob's formal tone wasn't a good sign. "The contract. I want to make sure everything's clear." A heartfelt moment eased the tension between them. Lucy realized that Jacob was becoming more human, more approachable. It made her like him even more, even though she didn't want to admit it. One night, as Lucy was lying in bed reading, Jacob appeared at her door. He hesitated before stepping in, holding a small package in his hands. "I brought all the details," he said. "After the baby is born. It's important for me, too," Lucy replied, still looking out the window. "I think it's good to share these moments." Jacob hesitated before continuing. "I never thought something like this would affect me so much. I always saw it as a transaction. But today, hearing the heartbeat, I realized it's so much more than that." Lucy turned to face him. His cold words hit her like a bucket of ice water. Even though she knew it was going to happen, hearing Jacob speak so detachedly made her feel like he didn't care about her. "Right," she said, trying to stay calm. "What exactly do you mean?" Jacob hesitated again, looking at her. "I just want to make sure you're prepared to leave when the time comes. I know this will be difficult. It's important that we follow what was agreed upon." Lucy closed her eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the emotion stirring inside her. She couldn't hold it in for long. "Prepared?" she repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Do you really think it's that simple? That I can just leave like none of this ever happened?" Jacob frowned, clearly taken aback by her reaction. "I didn't mean, no." "Jacob," she interrupted, standing up, "for you. This is just a business deal. Isn't it? Something to secure your precious heir, but for me, this is my life. My body. My health. My feelings." Jacob stood as, "I can just leave like this never happened." Jacob looked upset. "I didn't mean that. No. You're right. This is just a business deal. Isn't it? Something to secure your precious heir. But for me, this is my life. My body. My health. My feelings." Lucy stood up, clearly uncomfortable. "That's not fair. I never said it was just a transaction. That's how you treat it." Her voice broke as she continued. "You never see me as anything more than part of your plan. You never think about what I'm going through. What this means to me." Her words cut deep, though Jacob tried not to show it. He knew he had been insensitive. He wasn't prepared to handle the intensity of Lucy's emotions. "I know this is hard for you," he said, trying to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me?" Lucy stared at him, her eyes filled with hurt. "Sometimes I think you're incapable of feeling anything." "Jacob." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He took a deep breath, searching for a way to respond without making things worse. "I'm not perfect," Lucy said quietly. "And I never claimed to be. But I'm trying." Lucy crossed her arms, her heart still racing. "Try harder, Jacob," she said. "Because so far, all you've done is remind me that I'm temporary and can be replaced." Jacob stepped closer to her, his expression changing from defensive to remorseful. "You're not disposable," he said sincerely. "And if I've made you feel that way, I'm sorry." Lucy looked away, fighting back tears. His words sounded genuine. The pain she felt wouldn't go away. "I fade so easily. Sometimes I wish this contract had never existed. The longer this goes on, the harder it gets." Lucy's words hung in the air. Jacob stood in silence, absorbing her words. For the first time, he understood the emotional toll this arrangement was taking on Lucy. He began to admit to himself that the connection between them was more than he'd realized. He knew he had been insensitive. He wasn't prepared to handle the intensity of Lucy's emotions. "I know this is hard for you," he said, trying to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me?" Lucy stared at him. Her eyes filled with hurt. "Sometimes. I think you're—" He began hesitantly. "I don't know how to undo what I've done. I want to try. I want to do this in a way that doesn't hurt you anymore." She finally looked at him, seeing something different in his eyes. It wasn't the usual coldness. Something softer. More human. "Then start by. You're being honest, Jacob, because if we keep pretending this doesn't matter, it's going to destroy us." Jacob nodded, realizing he could no longer run from what he felt, that he didn't know exactly how to move forward. He knew he had to try. Let's play a little game for those who only read the comments. Type hot dog in the comments. Only those who make it this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. The argument had ended. The tension between them lingered. Lucy retreated to her room while Jacob stayed in the garden, reflecting on everything that had happened. He felt like he was losing control. For the first time it didn't seem he knew he had been insensitive. He wasn't prepared to handle the intensity of Lucy's emotions. "I know this is hard for you," he said, trying to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me?" Lucy stared at him. Her eyes filled with hurt. "Sometimes. I think you're like a bad thing." In her room, Lucy stared at the album she'd been filling, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. She knew she was becoming attached not just to the baby, to Jacob as well. That scared her. Outside, Jacob gazed at the sky, searching for clarity amid the chaos in his thoughts. He knew he needed to change. Not he knew he had been insensitive. He wasn't prepared to handle the intensity of Lucy's emotions. "I know this is hard for you," he said, trying to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me?" Lucy stared at him. Her eyes filled with hurt. "Sometimes I think you're of the contract." Because of Lucy. The first time, he cared about someone in a way he couldn't ignore. The day started quietly at the mansion. Lucy felt something different. There was a strange pressure in her abdomen. A growing sense of discomfort. She tried to brush it off and go about her usual activities. As time went on, the pain grew worse. In the library, Jacob was looking over documents when Stephanie, the housekeeper, hurried in. "Mr. Miller. There's something wrong with Miss Lucy," she said, her voice full of concern. Jacob immediately stopped what he was doing and hurried to Lucy's room. When he opened the door, he knew he had been insensitive. He wasn't prepared to handle the intensity of Lucy's emotions. "I know this is hard for you," he said, trying to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me?" Lucy stared at him. Her eyes filled with hurt. "Sometimes. I think you're," her sitting on the edge of the bed, struggling to breathe. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Her hands were trembling. "Lucy. What's happening?" he asked, kneeling beside her. I think it's time," she said, between short breaths. It hurts. Jacob. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach at the sight of her so vulnerable. Without. He knew he had been insensitive. He wasn't prepared to handle the intensity of Lucy's emotions. "I know this is hard for you," he said, trying to remain calm. "But it's not easy for me either. Do you think I don't feel anything? That this isn't affecting me?" Lucy stared at him. Her eyes filled with hurt. "Sometimes I think you're." He helped her stand and guided her to the car. On the way to the hospital, Jacob gripped the steering wheel tightly. His usual calm demeanor completely shattered. He could think of nothing except ensuring Lucy and the baby were safe. "It's going to be okay," he said. More to himself than to Lucy. She looked at him, seeing the worry on his face. Jacob seemed as human as anyone else. When they arrived at the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses immediately attended to them. Lucy was taken to the delivery room, while Jacob, usually in control of every situation, felt utterly powerless. He tried to stay calm. He was terrified. In the waiting area, he paced, seeing the worry on his face. Jacob seemed as human as anyone else. When they arrived at the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses immediately attended to them. Lucy was taken to the delivery room, while Jacob, usually in control of every situation, felt utterly powerless. He tried to stay calm. Fear took over. In the waiting area, he paced back and forth, looking at the door anxiously. Every minute felt like an eternity. He had never cared about anything he couldn't control. Now he felt completely vulnerable. A nurse came in and called his name. "Mr. Miller. Miss Lucy has asked for you to join her in the delivery room." Jacob stopped for a moment, surprised by the request. He didn't hesitate to follow. When he entered, he found Lucy. He looked at the door, worried. Time seemed to last forever. He had never cared about anything he couldn't control. Now he felt completely vulnerable. A nurse came in and called his name. "Mr. Miller," she said. "Miss Lucy has asked for you to join her in the delivery room." Jacob stopped for a moment, surprised by the request. He didn't hesitate to follow. When he entered, he found Lucy lying on the bed, pale but determined. Their eyes met. He felt a wave of emotions. "You came," she said, smiling weakly. "Of course I did," he replied, stepping closer and taking her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The labor was intense. Lucy gripped Jacob's hand tightly with each contraction, while he did his best to comfort her. "You're doing great," he said, his voice softer than ever. "I'm here, Lucy. I agree with you." She was struggling to speak, concentrating on breathing deeply. Jacob, on the other hand, felt completely helpless. He would do anything to relieve her pain. All he could do was stand next to her. Suddenly, the sound of the baby's first cries filled the room. Jacob stopped moving. His eyes were fixed on the tiny life that had just entered the world. It was a boy. Perfect and. She was struggling to speak. Jacob was worried. He felt helpless. He wanted to help her. He couldn't do anything. He stayed with her. Suddenly, the baby started crying. Jacob stopped moving. He looked at the baby. He was healthy. The nurses cleaned the baby and gave him to Lucy. She was crying. She didn't say anything. He's beautiful, she said quietly. Jacob moved closer to the baby. He looked at the baby's red face. He felt very happy and proud. He felt like he was part of the baby. He didn't just want to help. He wanted to be a part of the baby's life. He's Jacob, he said. He didn't finish. He was too excited. He's incredible, he said. Lucy looked at him, seeing a new expression. Jacob's eyes were filled with tears. He couldn't hide them. Do you want to hold him? She asked, offering the baby to him. Jacob hesitated for a moment before gently taking the baby in his arms. He looked down at the boy, marveling at how fragile and perfect the tiny life was. Hello, little one, he said softly. It's me. Dad. Lucy watched the scene, feeling both happy and sad. She knew this moment was special. She also knew that soon she would have to let go of the baby. The contract was a constant reminder of the inevitable. After a few hours, Lucy was moved to a recovery room. Jacob stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand as though afraid she might disappear. Thank you, Lucy, he said, finally speaking up. I can never repay what you've done for me. She looked at him, tired but smiling. I didn't do this for you, Jacob. I did it for the baby and for my mother. I'm glad you're here. He deserves to be loved. Jacob felt a lump in his throat. Her words were sincere. They saddened him. He knew Lucy was saying goodbye, goodbye to the baby. Goodbye to something much bigger. While Lucy slept, Jacob held the baby in his arms, studying him as if trying to memorize every detail. He thought about all the decisions that had led to this moment. He realized his life would never be the same. The cold exterior he had built over the years was crumbling. He was no longer just a businessman or an arrogant millionaire, he was a father. That changed everything. Jacob knew he needed to make a decision that he decided to change the terms of the contract. Even though it seemed insignificant at first. He looked at Lucy, who was peacefully asleep, at the baby in his arms. I'm not going to let it end like this, he whispered to himself. He knew the next step would be the hardest of his life. For the first time, he was willing to fight for something that truly mattered. The next morning, an unusual stillness filled Jacob's mansion. In the hospital room, Lucy sat on the bed, holding the baby in her arms, while Jacob watched from a chair was sitting nearby. The boy slept peacefully, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions his parents were facing. Lucy. It was a bittersweet moment. She knew she would soon have to say goodbye. Every second with her son felt very precious. Jacob, on the other hand, was conflicted. Years. He had prided himself on being rational and calculated, always following his plans. Now, watching Lucy with the baby, he realized there was something much greater at stake. He hesitated, trying to find He found the perfect words to say what he needed to. You seemed lost in thought, Lucy said, breaking the silence. He took a deep breath, ran a hand through his hair, then replied, I am. There's a lot I need to reconsider, he admitted. Lucy looked up, surprised by how honest he was being. Until now, Jacob had been determined to stick to the contract. There was something different about his expression. Jacob started hesitantly, saying, I know the situation isn't easy for either of us. Please don't make it harder. When the time comes, Just let me go. Don't make the inevitable longer than it needs to be. Her words hurt Jacob like a knife. A sudden anger surged within him. Not at Lucy. At himself. He was angry at the man who had signed such a cold, unfeeling contract without considering the emotional impact it would have. Do you think I want it to end like this? He stood up. Angry. Do you think this was just a plan for me? Lucy stared at him. Surprised. Intensity of his reaction. Jacob, I don't know what to think. You've always been so distant and so practical. He ran his hands over his face as if trying to calm himself. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Maybe I was at first. That's not true anymore. I can't ignore what I feel now. Lucy averted her gaze, unable to look at him. What do you feel? She asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob moved closer, kneeling beside the bed so they were at eye level. He felt like he had done everything wrong. Like I treated you as part of a deal when you deserved so much more. He admitted. Like I've tried to protect my heart for so long. You've broken through all my defenses. Lucy felt tears welling up. Tried to hold them back. Jacob. That doesn't change the fact that we have a contract. She said with difficulty. I agreed to the contract because I had no other choice. He shook his head and pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Not anymore, he said, handing it to her. This is the contract. What's left of it? Lucy opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding the torn papers inside. She looked at Jacob in disbelief. You tore up the contract? Why? He took her hand, looking into her eyes with sincerity she had never seen before. You have seen this before. I don't want you to leave Lucy. Not you. Not the baby. I want you to stay. Not because you have to. Because I want you to. Lucy felt the tears finally fall. She wanted to believe his words. She was afraid of getting hurt. Jacob. You don't understand. It's not that simple. She paused, swallowing hard. I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything. He nodded, accepting her hesitation as fair. I know it's not simple. I don't expect you to trust me right away. He said, his voice steady. But I'm willing to fight for this, for you. Our son. Us. Lucy's heart raced. She looked at the baby in her arms and then at Jacob. There was something in his eyes that made her believe he was telling the truth. Are you really willing to change? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes. He replied without hesitation. For the first time in my life. I know exactly what I want. It's you. Lucy. You and our son. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with hope. Lucy looked at Jacob, searching for the right words to respond. Deep down, she knew she felt something for him, too. Something that had quietly grown over the months. But admitting it was terrifying. I'll try. She finally said. I need time. Jacob. I need to know this quickly. He nodded, clearly relieved by her response. I'll give you all the time you need. Just don't ask me to give up on you. In the weeks that followed, Jacob did everything he could to show Lucy he was serious. He adjusted his schedule to spend more time with her and the baby, setting aside commitments that once seemed non-essential. That it was up for discussion. He supported her in every decision, showed patience. Most importantly, demonstrated genuine care. Lucy, in turn, began to let her guard down. Little by little. Although she still feared being hurt. Jacob's gestures gave her hope that perhaps they could build something together. In the same garden where so many tense conversations had taken place. Jacob held the baby in his arms while Lucy watched him. The sky was clear. The sun felt warm and comforting. "I think we're finally on the right path," Jacob said, looking at the baby and Lucy. She smiled, feeling happy in her chest. "Maybe we are," she replied, reaching out to take his hand. Jacob looked at her. In that moment, they both knew they were ready to face the future together. Not as part of a contract. As a family. Months had passed since the baby's birth. Jacob's mansion was now filled with life. Lucy, more at ease, spent her days caring for the baby and organizing small family moments with Jacob. He, in turn, had become a completely different man. Once a cold and calculating millionaire, he was now a devoted father and a man. The future would be together. Not as part of a contract. As a family. Months had passed since the baby was born. Life was now filling Jacob's mansion. Lucy, feeling more at ease, spent her days caring for the baby and organizing small family moments with Jacob. He, in turn, had become a completely different man. Once a cold and calculating millionaire, he was now a devoted father and a man. He was willing to do anything for the people he loved. Lucy was very happy that her mother had a successful surgery months earlier. After years of worry, it was an indescribable relief to see her mother healthy and full of energy. Lucy's mother, Donna Rosa, frequently visited the mansion. Enchanted by her grandson and thrilled to witness the transformation in both her daughter and son-in-law. One evening, Jacob surprised Lucy with a special dinner in the garden. He asked her to dress up, which she found unusual but agreed to do. When she stepped outside, she was amazed by the beautiful decorations, soft lights and rose petals scattered on the ground. A table with a centerpiece of flowers was set up under a flower archway, lit up by moonlight. "What is all this?" Lucy asked. Surprised, he led her to the table, where they would celebrate everything they had built together that night. He replied with a calm smile. "You deserve it." The dinner was filled with laughter and shared memories. Jacob was more relaxed than she had ever seen him. Lucy felt more connected to him with every passing moment. When the meal ended, Jacob stood up and walked toward her. His eyes showed a mix of nervousness and determination. "Lucy," he began, taking her hands and slowly kneeling before her. "I never imagined I'd meet someone like you. When you came into my life, I thought this would just be a cold transaction. You brought warmth, love, and purpose. You've changed me in ways I never thought possible." Lucy felt tears well up in her eyes, her breath catching with emotion. "I love you, Lucy. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" "Purpose, you've changed me in ways I never thought possible." Lucy felt tears well up in her eyes, her breath catching with emotion. "I love you, Lucy. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" Lucy covered her mouth with her hands, unable to hold back the smile and tears that blended together. A moment. Everything felt surreal. Deep down, she knew her answer. Yes. Jacob. I will, she said. Her voice filled with emotion. Jacob slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a tight embrace. My wife. Lucy covered her mouth with her hands, unable to hold back the smile and tears that blended together. A moment. Everything felt surreal. Deep down, she knew her answer. Yes. Jacob. I will, she said. Her voice filled with emotion. Jacob slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a tight embrace, before kissing her with all the love he felt. The baby, sitting nearby in a stroller, let out a noise as if celebrating, which made them both laugh. A few months later, Jacob and Lucy married in an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden. Only close friends, loyal staff members. Lucy's mother attended. Lucy looked stunning in a simple yet elegant white dress that accentuated her natural beauty. Jacob, in a sharp black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. Donna Rosa sat in the front row, tears of joy in her eyes seeing her daughter happy and healthy, standing beside a man who clearly loved her. Was everything she had ever wanted, dreamed of. It was hard to believe that just months ago, she had undergone a risky surgery and now had the chance to witness this special moment in Lucy's life. As Lucy walked down the aisle with the baby in her arms, Jacob felt a wave of emotion so overwhelming he could barely hold back his tears. When they exchanged vows, their wedding vows, every word seemed to seal the bond they had built with so much effort and love. I promise to stand by your side through every moment, Lucy, Jacob said, holding her hands. You are my home, my heart, the greatest gift life has ever given me. Lucy, her eyes glistening, responded, Jacob, you gave me hope when I. She looked stunning in a simple yet elegant white dress that accentuated her natural beauty. Jacob, in a sharp black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. Donna Rosa sat in the front row, tears of joy in her eyes, seeing her daughter happy and healthy, standing beside a man who clearly loved her. Was everything she had ever hoped for. I promise to love and support you in everything because you are my safe harbor. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the guests erupted into warm applause as Jacob pulled Lucy into a kiss filled with passion and tenderness. Donna Rosa, emotional, held her grandson in her arms. Donna Rosa sat in the front row, tears of joy in her eyes. She smiled at the couple. You are my greatest joy, she said, her voice filled with gratitude and love. Months after the wedding, the family's life was full of love and small joys. One day, Lucy began feeling nauseous. She decided to see the doctor at Jacob's insistent urging. At the appointment, she received news that she looked stunning in a simple yet elegant white dress that accentuated her natural beauty. Jacob, in a sharp black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. Donna Rosa sat in the front row, tears of joy in her eyes, seeing her daughter happy and healthy, standing beside a man who clearly loved her. Was everything she had ever. It changed everything once again. Congratulations, Mrs. Miller, the doctor said with a smile. You're pregnant again. This time it's twin girls. Lucy was in shock for a few moments before a wave of happiness washed over her. When she shared the news with Jacob, he froze, processing the information. Twins, he finally said. Jacob was amazed. Donna Rosa sat in the front row, crying with happiness. She could see her daughter was happy and healthy. She was with a man who clearly loved her. Yes, Lucy replied, laughing. Are you ready for this? Jacob laughed and embraced her. If it's with you. I'm ready for anything. The next few months were filled with preparations for the twins' arrival. Jacob and Lucy turned the mansion into a true home, full of laughter. Jacob was in awe of his daughter, Lucy, who was stunning in a simple yet elegant white dress that accentuated her natural beauty. He was sitting in the front row. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Donna Rosa, his wife, was in tears of joy. She was seeing her daughter happy and healthy, standing beside a man who clearly loved her. It was the most precious moments of her life. Jacob had cried when he held their girls in his arms, feeling more complete than he had ever imagined. One evening, the family was gathered in the living room. Jacob watched Lucy play with their children. Their son, now almost 2 years old, was giggling while the twin girls slept peacefully. Donna Rosa sat in the front row, crying with joy. She could see her daughter, happy and healthy, standing beside a man who clearly loved her. It was everything she had ever wanted. Nearby, Jacob felt a warmth in his chest. It was something he had never experienced before. Thank you, Lucy, he said, approaching her and hugging her from behind. For what? She asked, turning to look at him. For teaching me what love is, he replied, kissing her on the forehead. Lucy smiled, holding his hand, thanked him. Donna Rosa was in the front row, crying with joy. She had always wanted a family. Now she had one. Jacob and Lucy stood there with their children, surrounded by the love they had built together. Jacob, who used to be a cold and lonely man. Lucy, who had faced so many struggles, were finally happy. That moment was a new beginning. A life filled with love, hope, happiness. What did you think of Jacob's actions toward Lucy? Share your opinion in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our stories. Make sure to check out more emotional stories by clicking here on the end screen.